You've taken an unusual, well, some would regard an unusual personal step, I think about 10, 11 years ago, that you decided to stop flying, which as an academic, a high-flying academic, if I might say, that must have been presented a lot of practical challenges. Why do you think that's important, or is it important?
I think it is important, and I don't think it's just the flying, but and I tried to make some other changes to some areas of my life. But the reason that I probably flag up the flying is it's emblematic. Firstly, two things. Firstly, it's emblematic of what we see as progress. You know, the more we fly, the more we can, and we have. It's like a positional good. You know, I flew to the States 5 times last year for these important meetings. It adds not only to what we think is good about ourselves, but we think it reflects well for other people looking at us that we're this high flyer. There's something about that that's attractive. So I think to actually try to unpick that, undermine it, to say we can still run good, successful careers without having to resort to these incredibly high carbon forms of transport. So I think it's important from an emblematic point of view. The emissions are relatively much less important. No doubt they all add up. If people like me and others start to make these changes, that's important from an emissions point of view, but most important is the message that we're showing or we're demonstrating to others, that you can live and work in an academic community, in my case, and have a good, successful career without having this enormously high carbon footprint. And what's also particularly important about aviation, unlike all other forms of transport, it's the one form of transport that looks incredibly difficult to decarbonise. So when I decide to fly, I am sending a market signal to carry on building and expanding our airports, which is occurring, of course, everywhere, to buy more planes, which all of this is locking us up into very high carbon futures. Aviation within the UK represents about 7% of our emissions. Globally, it's about 2 to 3%, depending how you measure it. Now, that's the emissions equivalent between the UK and Germany, just from aviation emissions, and it is growing much more rapidly than any country's emissions, with no prospect of us finding a low-carbon alternative. So when you put all of that together, from technically, socially, symbolically, every facet of aviation is playing against the agenda to avoid dangerous climate change. And I think it's incumbent on those of us who work on climate change to demonstrate we think the issue is so important, the climate change issue is so important, we're prepared to make those sorts of changes. How on earth can we expect the people who are 32,000 feet beneath us to believe our message about making rapid changes and deep changes to their levels of emissions, when those of us who are pulling the science together carry on with very high carbon footprints and lifestyles? So I think making the change adds credibility to our research, even though obviously it doesn't increase the quality of our research, but it adds credibility to the research.